so much for listening to us while you're enjoying your lunch today. We look forward to doing the weekly livestock market update. Normally, I would say I'm your host, Meghan Grebner, with me, Scott Brown, University of Missouri, livestock economist extraordinaire. We're going to talk today cattle on feed numbers. We're going to do a little preview for cattle inventory, which comes out at the end of the month. And my favorite topic, actually, right now, is to talk about consumer demand, especially after the consumer sentiment report came out yesterday. So as we get going, let's recap what happened this week in the markets.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. So if we think about last week, number one, it was cold. So it was cold for a lot of us and a lot of snow in some places. So slaughter was slow in some cases. So we had pretty limited tests on the cattle side, but we were a couple dollars lower in terms of cash-fed cattle prices. If we looked at those nearby futures contracts for both fed cattle and feeder cattle, we were higher this week, which to me signals some positives as we look ahead. The one for me this week that really jumped out was choice box beef prices, $12 higher this week relative to last week. So we're getting some stronger demand signals in terms of what we got in box beef.
When we take a look at the slaughter numbers, Scott, we've had Christmas holiday, New Year's holiday, so we've had a couple of weeks where runs have been down. That weather really made an impact on slaughter runs last week. How are things stacking up and getting going as we get into maybe a little bit more normal of a week this past week?
Yeah, so I think when we look at cattle slaughter in particular this week, a run of about 615,000 head of cattle that were slaughtered this week. That was some recovery from the previous week. We certainly saw a number of western Kansas processing facilities that the week prior was having a lot of trouble due to snow and cold weather that really reduced those runs. So we were up relative to where we were a week ago. But when you look at us relative to a year ago, we're still talking about roughly 10,000 head less cattle that were slaughtered this week than we saw a year ago.
When we take a look every week in our program, we talk USDA reports. We talk a little bit about what's going on in the markets. Really an opportunity this week for you guys to ask questions as well once we get wrapped up. And if you've got curveballs, he told me I couldn't throw them at him today. So this is your opportunity to whip a proverbial snowball or curveball at Scott Brown. Let's start first and talk about that cattle on feed report that came out yesterday.
Yeah, so we got pretty much news out of yesterday's cattle report that was near the pre-report estimates. Yeah, so I'll hold it as close as I can.
Yeah, go close.
All right, so maybe you can hear me now in the back of the room. It takes Megan to remind me to get this stuck up in the right place so we can amplify. All right, so cattle on feed was 102.1 of a year ago. When you look at January 1 on feed, that was very near pre-report estimates. The placements for December came in at 95.5% of a year ago. That also was very near pre-report estimates, but we're talking about fewer cattle placements. I think that's positive for cattle prices. It was sure a mixed bag in terms of where those placements occurred. Texas, Oklahoma seem to be the places where we're talking about placements at least equal to a year ago. Nebraska, Colorado, states where we saw placements that were more down relative to a year ago.
When we take a look at that placements number, I hear a 95 and I'm like, oof, that sounds like a big change in where we normally are, considering 100 is normal. But what are some things to think about when we hear a placement number that might be off a little bit or shocking when we're looking at it, but maybe it's not?
Yeah, so I think we're going to continue to talk about placement numbers that are going to run below year-ago levels as we look ahead here in 2024. I always say, be careful as you look at those numbers and don't make too much of a knee-jerk reaction to that. But it's going to depend on what folks are saying pre-report relative to what we actually get from USDA when that report's released, whether it's going to be positive or negative. This idea of having fewer placements to me just is this idea of we're going to see smaller cattle supplies for several months down the road here. I think that's the reason to be most optimistic about cattle markets.
All right. The one number we talk about, we don't get it every month, is that heifer placement number. When you take a look at this month, in that 39% range, I think that tells us we're not holding them back as much as we should be, or maybe think we should be, to grow the herd yet.
So I think everything we see in cattle on feed in terms of percentage of heifers on feed January 1 at 39.7, to be specific.
Sorry. Forgive me that 0.3%.
That's the difference between the economist and the media person. But 39.7 certainly does not suggest we're holding heifers back to build the herd. And we have not done that for several quarters. All right, just to put it in perspective for you all today, back in 2015, 2016, when we were talking about expanding the beef cow herd, we were talking about roughly 32% of the on-feed inventory being heifers. So until we start to see that further reduction in the percentage of on-feed being heifers, we're not holding heifers to build the herd. That's good news in terms of short-run supplies and prices as we look ahead.
But that's not the case everywhere, right? There are some areas that might be holding heifers back or not putting beef cows into slaughter, and we'll talk about that too. But again, I think that comes back to the key word, which is weather. Yeah, we certainly still have drought conditions in some parts of the country. I say it's hard to talk drought in the middle of winter, but it reminds me that I think the decision to expand as we look forward depends a lot on what happens this spring in terms of spring rains, summer rains. I think there are a lot of folks who are sitting on the sidelines thus far saying, I'm waiting till I rebuild forage supplies before I make that decision to expand. They may make that decision to expand fairly quickly. I always keep saying I think there's upside potential in these markets, but there's a lot of downside risk. It doesn't take long to go from 39.7% to 32% on feed of heifers. And so once that happens, I think markets will respond negatively to that information of increased supplies coming down the road. I'm amazed how quickly markets are responding these days to what we get in the news today. Even though we know once we start holding heifers, it's frankly years before we get more beef supplies, markets seem to react much more quickly to that news. But if we're not, and we'll talk livestock slaughter here in a second, but doesn't that also potentially pull back supplies in the short term if we're not placing as many heifers into feed yards?
Absolutely. So when you hear me talk, I'll still say I think we're going to be more optimistic about 2024 cattle prices than where many are at today. And I think that's part of the equation in the mix of once we start holding heifers, that's going to cut those supplies that much harder as we look ahead. And when you realize, don't forget 2023 was the first year since 2015 we've had lower beef production. It's going to happen again in 2024. I think it likely happens again in 2025. So it's still the beginning. Even when we start holding, we just suck down current supplies even further in terms of beef. It takes months before we're going to talk about additional beef on the marketplace.
This is January is one of those weird months where the USDA doesn't provide us livestock slaughter cold storage numbers the same week that we get cattle on feed. So it gives Scott and I more things to talk about week to week, but it also kind of puts us in a position where we have to pontificate and talk about what we might see in the coming weeks. Livestock slaughter comes out this next week. The number that Scott and I talk about all the time is beef cow slaughter, and why that matters to beef supply, profitability, and prices. So as you look ahead to this report this coming week, what are you watching for in that beef cow slaughter number?
Yeah, so when you look at what happened the first 49 weeks of 2023, we were down 11.4% in terms of beef cow slaughter. Some of you may then go, we're holding cows. And I go, no, I don't believe that's the case. 2022 beef cow slaughter was very high. We were liquidating very hard. I still see us in a liquidation phase. When you look at beef cow slaughter relative to beginning beef cow inventory, it's running at more than 10%, which tells me we're slaughtering enough cows that we're not holding cows back to try to grow the herd. So I think both sides of that equation certainly suggests fewer cows. Now, it can change quickly. And I think that's the thing we want to watch of as we go through this year and we start getting more beef cow slaughter information. When's that signal that we start to really draw down beef cow slaughter? Maybe it doesn't even happen this year, by the way. We're going to hinge a lot on what happens to weather in the next few months before we're going to know how producers respond to that.
Knowing that 2022 was such a big year for beef cow slaughter, knowing that we're pulling from a smaller pool of beef cows in general, do you have a number in your head, like a Beautiful Mind type, thinking if we're going to take some movie references, right, Matt Damon and, like all the numbers on the figure. Is there one that jumps out at you that says, we're keeping beef cows, we're not putting them in, just because there's that discrepancy in beef cow slaughter from 2022?
Yeah, so I think the thing that I'm going to watch is percentage of beginning inventory that we're slaughtering. That's going to take us a little bit into 2024 before we're going to know too much. But for me, if we're slaughtering 7% or less of beginning inventory, that might be enough for us to begin to grow. And so that's what we're going to watch. I think beef cow slaughter will continue to run below year-ago levels as we start here in 2024, given where we are today. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're building the herd yet.
So let's talk cattle inventory numbers come out January 31st. I'm sure, like many of you, I will be in Orlando for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association's convention. And there's going to be a great opportunity to talk to economists there as well about crunching those numbers. Looking ahead to, today's the 20th, 11 days from now, what are we watching for? What do we need to watch for in that cattle inventory report?
Yes, I already say it. We're going to write the headline yet again of the smallest beef cow herd in decades. That was really the news we got out of last January's report. You have to go back to the early 1960s to talk about having an inventory of beef cows is low. So I know we're going to repeat that same story. I will say down maybe 3% in terms of beef cow inventory. We were down 2.6% July 1 of last year, so I think we've accelerated that a little bit in late 2023. But I think I would remind everyone that just because we're down 3% in beef cow inventory, don't equate that to the same thing happening in beef production. We're becoming more efficient, more productive. We're getting more pounds of beef out of that beef cow than ever before. So we want to remember that just because we have the smallest beef cow herd in decades, that doesn't equate into the smallest beef production in decades.
I'm going to jump back for just a second. We talked about that livestock slaughter number, and we've talked about slaughter runs. Knowing we've had these shortened weeks with the holidays and the weather, how much does that potentially impact? You talk about being more productive, weights, and what do we need to think about that efficiency and production efficiency?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things here that are at play. When you look at slaughter weights for the last few weeks of 2023, they were higher. All right, so she says, get it closer again. So beef cattle slaughter rates that were higher the last few weeks, which reminds me that I think a lot of folks were holding cattle longer in those feed yards, waiting for higher prices. That coupled with cheaper corn, I think will continue to make slaughter weights run higher as we start 2024. We'll want to watch carefully as we move forward here, because we've had cold weather as well and we've reduced runs. So I think we have a lot of cattle coming for the next few weeks to try to catch back up. They're probably going to be heavier cattle.
And possibly at lower prices. And I hate to man, y'all are having lunch and nodding your head and talking. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the markets. So when we talked several times in 2023, we talked about these great cattle prices, but we were also talking about higher input prices. Cattle prices have come down. Input prices have also come down. What are some things that we and producers need to talk about, need to think about in terms of maximizing that bottom line, and a little bit about what's going on trend-wise in the markets and what's been happening?
Well, so number one, I'll say, I think the most positive thing coming here is, and for those that raise corn, sorry, but cheaper corn prices. We've been feeding a lot of very expensive corn. We've fed $7 corn for a period of time. It's been coming down. I think as long as we have a big crop in South America and a big plantings here next spring and no big weather, we could talk about 4 1/4 corn for a change. I think that helps on the cattle price side. I keep saying I'm not sure we're done with record cattle prices. It may be late spring, early summer before we get there, but I could see us still making a run at very high prices. I know some weren't happy with what happened the last several weeks of 2023. I might say we were a little overheated and we had some correction coming, but I think we could get spring and summer and see some pretty good prices yet again.
Might also one say the risk management conversation needs to come into play and should have been coming into play as well in 2023?
Yeah, absolutely. So those that listened to my session earlier today would have heard me preach about LRP and other risk management tools. I'll keep saying, I want you to go get that LRP contract to reduce the downside risk, but I don't want you to get an indemnity payment from that. If you get an indemnity payment, cattle prices did what? They went lower. So it's insurance. And I think that's important to realize. There is downside risk. Maybe it's more from the demand side of the picture, but protecting against downside risk, to me, makes a lot more sense when we're talking about cattle prices that have been at record or near record prices.
You want to talk demand? You want to talk a little bit more markets?
You lead the way.
Okay. I'm going to go into demand because while Scott and I talk primarily cattle and beef today, we also talk about the hog sector. And the reason I bring this up is demand globally for U.S. pork has been strong. Demand for pork in the U.S. has hit a little bit of a struggle bus. Beef has not faced that same challenge domestically. And how is that benefiting long term?
Yeah, so for a minute, I think it's wise to talk about the pork side. I will say 2021 and 2022 were phenomenal demand years for all meats, pork included. 2023 for pork demand was really going back to where we were pre-2021. So although we talk about it as poor demand, and it was relative to those really strong years, I'll say 2021 and 2022 were phenomenal up years in all of those meats. So we need to keep that in perspective. I think for the same reason, we need to keep beef demand strong. And when we talk about running record or near record prices to consumers on the beef side, do they ever decide they're going to move away from beef? Now, I know in this audience, if I say, if you want to have a really good meal, what do you go eat? You all say pork loin, right? All right, so we all say steak. And I think that's just a reminder of how well we've positioned beef on the demand side. We need to keep that going. However, when we might talk about an economy that isn't going to grow quite as strong in 2024, that there might be some demand issues that we have to watch as we look forward.
I think you all need Taylor Swift to be your spokesperson. You saw what she's done for NFL football.
That's right, for the Chiefs.
We are not in the same football camp, and I'm probably in the minority in this room. But we do share a yellow color, at least in our football, our jerseys. So let's talk consumer demand. Consumer sentiment came out yesterday, and it was impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking about double-digit positive growth, about 13% higher in the consumer sentiment that came out this week relative to the previous month. That's the biggest jump we've seen in several months, which just tells me the general economy signs are getting stronger. I don't know how long it lasts because we know there are these things that continue to drag us potentially lower, higher interest rates, just the level of consumer debt we're carrying today. I'm not up here saying we're out of the woods yet, but when we've started 2024, most of the general economy signals we've got have been really strong. And consumer sentiment just went right along with that. And I'll say, some of you in the room may say, oh, no, it's going to be a tougher year. I'll just say, you'll be happy if we have stronger economic growth in this economy, because it makes beef demand stronger at the end of the day. And that's what we need to be paying attention to.
I think it's impressive to watch that whether it's consumer sentiment or beef demand, you're seeing retail prices go up and be at high levels. And people are still coming back for it. And maybe there's a little hesitancy, like, oh, I've got this big bill for my meat, but it's not stopping people in their tracks. And that's a testament to what you all do in terms of quality and making it a craveable product. But man, that's a really good story to tell moving forward.
So I always say we've done a wonderful job at meeting what consumers want on the plate. The product we're putting in front of them today is so much better than where we were 10 or 15 years ago. Pat yourself on the back for realizing we need to work on what consumers really want. Now, I will go a little bit further to say consumer tastes and preferences are always shifting. They're always changing. Do not think that we can rest with where we sit today in terms of what we're putting in front of consumers. It's going to keep changing. And so let's make sure that we continue to be focused on what's today's consumer really want on that center of plate. Again, I always say it's really nice to be able to say, if you're going to have a really good meal, what do you go eat? And you say steak. That is the right position. Don't think that the pork and chicken folks aren't nipping at the heels, trying to figure out how they get a piece of that action as well.
I'm sorry. A chicken wing is not going to ever stand up to a New York strip or a ribeye or whatever your choice of beef is.
Even if we wrap it with bacon, Megan, it won't make any difference?
No. And I mean, like, I'm a hog girl, right? I grew up in a hog farm. We raise cattle. I love my bacon, but that's not it. All right. So as we kind of wind things down and set the stage to transition for the other entertainment, I'm going to have you pull out your crystal ball and tell me what you think. Give me a short-term and a mid-range outlook for prices.
Well, so I think in the very short run here, we're going to see a lot of sideways for the next few weeks. However, I think as we get late spring, early summer, we could talk about prices that are $10 to $15 higher at the fed cattle level. And we will hit a new record high sometime in 2024. All right, for those that hear that prediction, just remember that I'm going to be wrong at the end of the day. And don't come up to me next year and say, hey, you told me we were going to be record cattle prices. But I'll just say I'm focused enough on how short we're going to get on the supply side that I don't think we're done with hitting record cattle prices. And I think by summer we could be there, Megan.
Mike, do we have time for a question or two? 2 questions. So first hand up gets to ask and throw the first snowball at Scott Brown.
Joe's over here.
Joe?
Scott, how big a swing could we see in cattle prices?
If you didn't hear in the back, he asked how big of a swing could we see in cattle prices?
All right, so this is to the downside risk that I think is really important for us to make a point about. So I've been actually doing a survey with a group of economists from around the country, and we recently asked, what's your lowest annual average fed cattle price for 2024? I had some economists answering $1.60. All right, so if that gives you some idea about the volatility, I think there's a lot of volatility. That's why you'll hear me talk a lot about risk management, just to trying to avoid that downside, especially if you're in an operation that can't handle a lot of risk. Those tools exist. I sometimes will say, this is where I like to be an economist for just a minute. I think demand for cattle generally has become less responsive to price. I say that because then it doesn't take a very big swing in supplies to get big swings in prices. I think we're going to see a lot more volatility ahead. The last thing I want is to be standing up here saying, I think we could get record cattle prices by summer, and something happened, the demand side slows down, and folks come back to me and say, hey, what happened? Because there are tools in the toolbox today that can protect that downside risk, and we should be using them.
Anybody else? If you have questions, Scott will be around and can ask, or you can ask them directly. Thank you all for your time today. If you'd like to subscribe to the Weekly Livestock Market Update, stop back and see me at the Brownfield Ag News booth. We'll get you signed up. And if you'd like to also check us out, you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, and all those fun things. Thank you very much.